And for the first 3 weeks, we focused on the addict and addiction as a disease and some of the blindness and denial and what I call conflictedism. And now we get to my favorite stuff. For the rest, probably the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at the families. This week, the spouses. Next week, the kids. And the week after, grief, loss, and unhooking from an addictive relationship and how that's a grieving process. And it's interesting because there's some new research on something called complicated grief, and that's addictive. You can get addicted to loss. And so if you're an addict or a codependent, it does the same thing in your brain as the drugs or the relationship does. And so it really helps me make some sense out of some of the issues with adult children and families and addiction that makes it hard, you know, how it makes it harder to stay quit and could contribute to relapse unless you do the work, to reconcile the loss, to do the grieving basically in the morning. So I'm going to spend a whole class on that. And I find that very interesting. I hope you will too. And then the last week we're going to talk about staying quit and recovery and sobriety and getting well and that type of thing. So I call in codependency, I'm not big on that term, but it's just what it is. You can call it relationship addiction or an addictive relationship pattern or whatever. It just means I'm addicted to, I'm coming up here with Sandra Smalley, who coined the term out of the cities. She has her definition with some symptoms. And the best definition I ever heard of codependency is just a quickie. It's losing the me and we. And I think with the addict, they have a codependent relationship with whatever they're addicted to. I call that losing the me and thee, whatever the addiction is. And so it's a lot of the same thing. It's really the disease of the disease, I think. And if you don't, my experience is, as a recovering person, that understanding this has been as important in my recovery as the sobriety and abstinence and understanding the whole addictive piece of it. This is more intangible and insidious. And some of this has been around as long as we had. Next week when I talk about kids, you will see how this process starts almost from day one or even pre-birth with some kids. So I've found this helpful in understanding my crazy, and that ain't an easy thing to do. Okay, so let's move on. What we're going to talk about today is Family Systems 101. And everything's a system. The weather's a system. The electrical in this house is a system. Our body's a system. Our automobile out there is a system. And what happens if a part of that system gets out of whack? It malfunctions. If my car, the engine, for example, gets out of whack, it don't run right. If the weather system gets out of whack, we get crazy weather. If my body system gets out of whack, I get sick. And when the family system gets out of whack, they end up getting in roles and things that end up becoming very detrimental to them and everybody in the system. So let's look at the family as a system. It's a system. It must stay in balance to be healthy and to function. And all right. Each member of the family plays a role to maintain that balance, whether you're aware of it or not. We all play roles to maintain the balance. And any stress that affects one member of the family affects every member in the family. Reach up and tap that mobile up there. You see? Everybody's got to adjust when there's stress, when something impacts the system, whether it be addiction, illness, death, divorce, violence, whatever it is. And that's true not only in families, it's true of organizations and churches and companies. I've done this same lecture with managers and supervisors in companies to help them understand how to relate and how to be a resource when problems come up with their employees. Okay. And here again, everybody has to adjust their roles to restore the balance. And these roles that we get into to try to bring the balance back, a lot of times are very fixed, they're very rigid, and they're very reactionary in that they tend to react to the symptom or the problem instead of the problem. And so, in fact, they miss the issue. Some of the roles that we see are, I call them reactor roles. First one is, we talked about this a little bit, when you see somebody you care about getting hurt, it's a normal reaction to want to try to protect them. And that by making excuses or buying into theirs or making sure that they're not going to, keep doing what they're doing, just taking care of them. Ultimately, that doesn't work. But you start to take responsibility. If I try to protect you and can't, now I feel like a failure. And so I adjust again because that doesn't keep the balance. The addict continues to act out and I have to adjust again to try to bring balance out. This time I'm going to try a little harder. I couldn't protect you, but damn it, I'm going to fix you now. And that's when you start trying to control the symptom, hiding the booze or the drugs or driving a person around or talking to them or whatever you have to do, locking them in their room, whatever you have to do to try to control them. Problem is you can't control another person. And I mentioned there's a paradox of control. The more I try to control another person, more that person controls me because now their behavior determines mine. And whether they're doing okay or not determines whether I feel like a success or a failure. And ultimately, I start to resent and blame the person for that. Because I keep trying to control them and they just don't cooperate. Right? And these roles become enabling over time. Because what they do is, as long as everybody else is adjusting, the person with the problem doesn't have to. He's the term for that is 10 God. He's a 10 God syndrome. Anybody ever grew up in an alcoholic family knows how that works, right? And so he always controls the mood and what everybody else does, depending on his mood or behavior. And so as long as everybody else is adjusting, he doesn't have to. And this is something you need to understand, that most addicts are very dependent people. They're dependent on their addiction and other people and everybody to help them and take care of them. And yet, they really resent their dependency. They're dependent, but they have a need to be independent. And every time you come in and start trying to take care of them, you're really validating how dependent they are. And they resent you doing that. Now here's the trick. They'll invite you to do it. Then they turn around and blame you and do a number on you for doing it. And over time, you start to resent that. And what that will do is destroy the relationship. Because here again, your motivation for trying to take care of them is because you care about them and love them. And I got this from one of my early mentors out in North Carolina, that caring and love cannot exist without justice. Justice means you suffer with the person, not because of them. And so when you keep getting set up and blamed and suffering because of him, over time the caring and love gets destroyed. It starts to be replaced by resentment and hate. And most of the time, if you ask somebody, hey, well, why do you do that? What are they going to tell you? Because I care about him and love him. I would say, no, that's not it. And codependents routinely confuse love and addiction. And they'll justify their addictive relationships in the name of love and caring. But to me, it's not loving and caring to do something that's going to destroy that long term. Love is doing what I need to do to help you get well and see the problem, not enabling you to get worse, because that's going to hurt both of it. if I'm doing something that's going to destroy the relationship and the love and caring, I don't think that's very loving or very caring. But that's a normal response. And so over time, the relationship gets destroyed because you mitigate the justice. You know, I was reading recently some of Richard Rohr's stuff about how God suffers with us. And I thought, you know, he has to. Because if he suffered because of us, that would destroy his love for us. You see what I'm saying? So, you know, so that's got to be there. Okay, here again, if God suffers along with us, then he's experiencing what we're experiencing. But if he suffers because of us, then his love and caring is gonna get destroyed, just like it would in any significant relationship. And so, one of Richard Rohr's lines is that only a suffering God could save. And I think that's a good concept. And so, when I was reading that, I thought it sure made a lot of sense to me. And it really enhanced my feeling of acceptance and how much God does love us. That he's willing to do that because he cares about us and loves us enough that he's willing to do that. And because of that, he's not going to suffer because of us. He's going to give us opportunities to heal and get well. He's not going to enable us. I don't think God's an enabler. Because that would be disrespectful and it would not be consistent with love and caring as I understand it. So that's just, this whole concept to me has been helpful in understanding God's role in my life, And I've put him through it, let me tell you. And the good news is he can handle it and he's not going to abandon me. And that gives it credibility too. You see what I'm saying? And so I've found that helpful. Okay, here again. So what we need to do is change our role. We need to transition from an enabling role to what I call an intervener. And the intervener role means that I start doing something to help the problem get better instead of enabling it to get worse. And when I start to do that, in order to do that, first thing I need to do is stop trying to figure out what's wrong with the addict and start looking at what's it got to do with me, how it's affected me, and my own attitudes and feelings in terms of what's happening with me. And I may need some help with that and a support system to help me deal with that, because I can't give you what I ain't got. I call it like getting swimming lessons if you want to keep somebody from drowning. And if you start doing that, if you stop enabling and start doing your own recovery, what's that going to do to the system? It's going to knock it out of balance, because any change in that system affects it. Except this time, now the addict and the person you're concerned about has to adjust. Okay, let's move it on up here. And my experience is he's not going to pat you on the back for it, all right? Okay, so let's look at some of the barriers and sidetracks here. The first thing that's so important, we'll get to that in a minute, is I have to keep the focus on myself and my recovery. Not because I don't care, but because I do. Instead of trying to figure out what's going on with the addict. And the addict has some weapons that they can use to try to keep us hooked into that enabling role. And one of the weapons he has is anger. The addict knows how to push our button so that we start blaming and raging and everything and pulls us back into that blamer role. I've heard stories, addicts coming home and trying to put the wife's button and, she didn't react. And they can get pretty extreme. In fact, I've worked with families and they would say, you wouldn't believe what he tried the other night. And once you start seeing it, and you smart fish don't bite is what my partner always said. And then you can see it for what it is and you can remain detached and say, well, That's what's wrong. I don't need to be a part of that. And it's good for everybody. Heard a story once about a guy came home one night and he'd tried everything he could. And the wife wouldn't react. And family in desperation, he took out all of her plants and lined them up and urinated in them. and I guess you could say that pissed her off. Because then she reacted, right? But she was able to see it and come in and say, and we would say, well, see, that's why it's important to make sure you got some backup. The other weapon is anxiety. The addict knows how to raise our anxiety level to where we do for the person what they need to do for themselves. And a good example of that is they're irresponsible financially. They write a bad check or they don't pay a bill. And you say, well, that's too bad. I'm not going to bail him out again. I'm going to let him suffer that consequence. Then you start thinking, well, you know what happens when that check bounces and, you know, he's going to get in trouble. And what are people going to think of us when they see we're bouncing checks? And what if they turn the electricity or the water off and all that kind of stuff? And finally, when your anxiety gets high enough, you run down and you cover that expense for him. And what you've done is established a pattern. The first thing you've said to him is, you don't have to be responsible. And the second thing you've done is you've gotten back into that caretaker enabling role. And and it just reinforces it that he can play that game. The other thing you'll see is the addict's reaction. Sometimes when you start getting well, they get worse. They just go crazy and start acting out, and it's really crazy. And this is where having a focus on me is important. Because if the focus is on the addict and I see him doing all that, I'm going to say, well, this ain't working. This is making it worse. And a lot of time, family will discontinue their recovery because they think it's not working. The next thing we see sometimes is the addict gets better. He starts being responsible and stops drinking. It's wonderful. Never seen it. And all of a sudden you think, well, he's all better now, so I don't need to keep doing this stuff. And in the first situation, the addict has basically intimidated you back into the system. In the second situation, he's conned you back into the situation. And so you stop your recovery work, and then I've seen him come back 6 months later, and it's 3 times as bad as it ever was. But if I'm focusing on me and my recovery, then whatever the addict's doing is what he's doing. And I can say, well, what are you going to do about that? I'm saying, I'm doing my work, now it's your turn. And that gives you some credibility, and it's very effective. Otherwise, you can get sucked back in a heartbeat. There are some complicating things that make that harder than it sounds. The first one is, a lot of times I feel really a greater sense of betrayal from the person once I start getting well, and instead of the person supporting it, they start trying to sabotage it. But I need to understand, now of course that's what they're doing, because that's how they're reacting to the system being affected. And you want them to react, If they start patting you on the back, you're probably doing it wrong. What I'm saying? Not that you're trying to harass them or anything. You're just saying, I'm going to get well. And I remember when I first got sober, I went and talked to my wife, and I told her, I said, and you don't have instantaneous insight. I said, I'm beginning to look at this thing, and I think that, that maybe just I might have. There was a movie once called A Slight Drinking Problem. Yeah, right. Might have a problem with alcohol, and I think I'm going to stop drinking and start going to some meetings and dealing with it. And it shook the system up. Her reaction is, nah, you're just getting carried away with this alcohol stuff. And I remember what I said, and every once in a while I'll say something really smart, and it scares the heck out of me. I don't know where it comes from. I remember I looked at her and I said, well, it's not important for you to know. It's important for me to know. and I'm going to do what I need to do to deal with it. And I'd really like for you to be a part of that, but if you can't or won't, then I'll have to do it in spite of you, which I did, and eventually she came along, and I know it's probably saved their marriage, and it's been a good thing for both of us. But if I'd have needed for her to jump in and sanction it, I'd have been in trouble. So sometimes you have to do it in spite of the people around you. Whether not only the addict, but other people in the system can be threatened by it too. So that's why it's real important that you make that commitment, first of all, to yourself, and understand that that's the best thing you can do for the system is get well and do your own work. And so that can be very helpful. The other thing is, this is particularly if you got a gambling addict or compulsive spender, you need to define the management of money from an internal locus of control. The term in gambling is trust but verify. You see what I mean? Don't believe what they tell you. Say, well, I hope that's true, but I'm going to check it out just to make sure. You see what I'm saying? And that's true with any addict. So that can be important. Otherwise, you can end up like people I've seen find out that all their retirement's been gambled away, or the house is on foreclosure, and it got a couple $100,000 in debt that they know anything about. And that can get back to the betrayal stuff, you see. But if I'm focusing from here and keeping track of that and checking it out and verifying it, not that I'm going to try to catch you, I'm taking care of myself here and you too, kind of thing. Because this can hurt both of us. And that's a good approach to take to that. Okay. Here again, that whole externalization, in general needs to be addressed. Because that's one of the primary things is I've made out here more important than here. And where do you think we learned that? One of the first things we learn in a family is whatever gets attention is what's important. And if I ain't getting it, then I'm not worth it. And if the problem's getting all the attention, what I learn is that that's what's really important. And getting back to that dependent-independent conflict. What do you think an addict might have a problem with is dependency? If you grow up in an addictive family, what do you learn about being dependent on people? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And what happens when you are? You get hurt. And so you learn, I ain't going to be like that. See what I'm saying? So that whole piece can go back to shame and issues that have been around long as we have too. So, and reinforcing that's not helpful either. And so the addict needs some help with that too. And I happen to believe codependency is an addiction. These are the criteria for an addiction. All addictions are primary relationships. I believe that, for example, an alcoholic has a primary codependent relationship with alcohol. Drug addicts with whatever their drug is, gamblers with gambling. And all you have to do is look at their reaction if that relationship gets threatened. The first thing they try to do is protect it. And when that doesn't work, then they try to control it. And then when that doesn't work, they look for somebody to blame. And if they can't find anybody here, they blame themselves. And so that whole process is intact in terms of their relationship with the chemical. And so they need to deal with that relationship. In a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about detachment, how I need to do more than just quit the addiction. I need to unhook emotionally from that relationship. And that whole process is a grieving process. So to be continued. And here again, the primary relationship, there's preoccupation with the object of the addiction. There's lost control over the behavior related to the addiction. And that doesn't matter whether you're a family member or the addict. Think about some of the things you've done in relationship to trying to deal with the addict. Does it make sense? Would you call that some loss of control? How many of you have been in that situation? By the way, remember week 1 we talked about the phases. You've got the non-problem, then you got the abuse, and then you got the addiction. The symptom that separates the abuse from the addiction is loss of control. When I cannot always predict the outcome of my behavior, once I get involved in an addictive process, that's loss of control. Now, most people can. Most people that drink don't have to worry about drinking one and then a case later ending up downtown in jail. I don't understand those people, but that's not an issue for them. I mentioned that, I don't have to deal with that with green beans. I don't have to worry about eating a can of green beans and then another whole case and beating my wife up. That's just not an issue. And that's just, so that doesn't happen until there's something wrong. And the way you know when something's wrong is when you start to lose control over the behavior. I love it. Guy told me once, if you don't have to get up and look outside, see if your car's parked there, you wasn't drunk. Well, here a good example would be how I react to the addict. He comes in and pushes my button, and I go off, and I become the bad guy. Or I say, I'm not going to do this, and I do it anyway, whatever this happens to be, whether it be enabling, whether it be, bailing him out with money or whatever. So, it's variable depending on the relationship and how the addict's reacting. So, yeah. And here again, so that loss of control, that's the primary symptom of addiction, is loss of control. That's the way you know you're an addict. Once you lose control, then that's different. The next thing we see is tolerance. We've talked about that, how our tolerance goes up. And the best way to define that is, think about a relationship you've been in that has been dysfunctional, and some of the things you put up with or tolerated. If I had told you before you got into that relationship that you would have endured or put up or tolerated those kinds of behaviors, what would you have told me? No way. And if I asked some street drunk, first time I ever drink, someday you're going to be sleeping under a bridge drinking 2 gallons a day, what do you think he would have told me? No way. And it's so it builds up and we don't see it. And there's physical and there's emotional tolerance. And then when I break the relationship, I experience a withdrawal reaction. It can be anything from really severe depression or severe mental health issues to irritability or just being physically sick. So those, that fits with addictions. And we don't think about that with something with what I'd call process addiction, like codependency, because we're not looking for it. We don't think anything about it. That's just normal. It's just what you do, right? But maybe it's not normal. Maybe there's something wrong. So, okay. What is codependency? This is Sandra Smalley's definition. Codependency is a learned relationship pattern of behaviors, feelings, and beliefs in which a person tends to be more externally than internally located. I make out here more important than in here. It's like being addicted to the outside of me. It goes on to say, this exaggerated, painful dependency dynamic is linked to high-stress environments and accompanied by personal self-neglect. And if I'm busy taking care of everybody else, who's going to get left out? And that's why I really push, hey, maybe it's time you took care of you, because you can't give what you ain't got. And the lifeguard thing, drowning with people don't help them. But you can't swim for them either. And so that's so hard because it's so counterintuitive and so alien to everything they've ever learned or thought about what they need to do to try to be okay and help other people. Okay, so here's some of her symptoms. I've done some training with her, by the way. She's very, very sharp. I don't know if she still has a practice or not. The first one is that external focus of control, a preoccupation outside of you, which I think is an outer reach for insecurity. And the more I feel betrayed and abandoned in here, the more I have to look out there, because there's nothing in here for me to come back to. That's about, you see, is that a vicious cycle? Okay, I've got an asterisk here. We'll come back to that. And then there's that high tolerance for inappropriate behaviors. Then there's unmet dependency needs, and some of that can go back to childhood and stuff. Not knowing how to get my needs met when it comes to dependency. Addictions, and I agree, can be a symptom of codependency. Alcohol, gambling, drug, food, sex, etc. I think that's kind of a spin-off of my codependency. That's sometimes a part of how I make sense out of it. It's just kind of a continuation of it in a more tangible way sometimes. Okay. There are issues related to patterns of belonging. And if you talk with addicts or even codependents, they almost always say, I never felt like I belonged. I never fit in really very good, and I was kind of, In the Bible, God talks about being afar, not being and not being, feeling like you belong. You go, and here's the other one, self-neglect. When that's a symptom. And what I'm saying is, charity begins at home. Okay. And then there's discouragement. It's very discouraging to try to do something you can't do. If I try to control the weather in Wisconsin, would that be discouraging? Just a little bit. So that's kind of what you're trying to do. And then there are shame-based issues. And shame is a feeling like I'm bad or worthless or defective. Something wrong with me. It's a judgment of who I am as bad and worthless. And that's what I experience when I keep trying to fix somebody and can't. Like it must be something wrong with me. There's a tendency to function in the extremes. I'm all or nothing, black or white, 100% this or 100% that. And those extremes are very stressful. And the extremes are closer to each other than the middle. The middle is where you're going to find balance and not going to be as stressful. But the middle is also a gray area where I'm not going to know as much. The extremes give me the illusion of knowing what I'm doing. But in effect, it makes it worse because it eliminates a lot of different choices. And Sandra Smalley always said that the difference between being a victim and not being a victim is that victims don't have choices. So you need to make sure you give yourself choices. There are issues related to inadequate launching. And that's how we leave our families. And her ideas ought to be a celebration when you leave your family. And well, what happens when they build a new ship and send it out? What do? They have a big celebration, christen it, and they'll say, no matter where you go in the world, you always have a safe port to come back to. How many of you got that message from your family? Most of us don't get that. We either run screaming away or we drift away in the cover of darkness or something, And so that leaves some woundedness that that can hurt us too. Then another one is assertiveness issues, setting boundaries, and I have a hard time saying no. And people don't mind taking advantage of you when you're like that, And I remember when I work with these people and say, person would come in and say, well, this guy told me to go pick some beans out of his garden. And I said, oh, why don't you tell him pick his own beans? Well, I couldn't do that. What would he think of me? You see, and that's giving up power and really people take advantage of that. That's just one example. And there are relationship issues. Addicts routinely confuse intimacy with intensity. And addictions are very intense. And dysfunctional relationships are very intense. And they tend to be stimulating. And if you grow up in a crazy family, it's the same thing. You learn that intensity is intimacy, because that's how you connect and relate to everybody in a family. So intimacy is connecting around who I am and who you are, and having a real deep, meaningful relationship with the other person. And well, yeah, there you go. You can get into drama. That's true. And then our last one is high stress environment patterns. And there's an asterisk there. There are two symptoms that occur across the board with relationship addiction. The first one is that external locus of control. And the other one is high stress environment patterns. And some new research on grief shows that the environment is what triggers neurophysiology that creates addiction. I'll talk about that next week when we look at kids and how they get affected. Okay. All right. This is Duran Jacobs. Now, Dewey Jacobs is a psychologist who's done a lot of work with gamblers, particularly adolescent gambling and things like that. And his definition really shows you how important family of origin is in terms of some of this stuff. He says addiction is a self-inflicted dependency state which is acquired over time by a predisposed person designed to relieve a chronic stress condition. And what symptom occurs across the board in codependency? The stress, and that starts real young. Okay, what do we got next? Characteristics: unhappiness as a child, do not like themselves, and may have hated who they were. First of all, I'm not sure that they know who they are. And I think part of recovery is getting that back. So what you don't like is the out here in terms of, and that's who I think I am. And once I get into my God self, I can be okay with that. And I'm going to talk about what that looks like next week too. Okay, and they dislike what parents or significant others did to hurt them. There's reoccurring panic, guilt, shame, and or despair from which they sought relief. And to me, if you didn't seek relief from that, you'd be stupid. But there are some ways that are better than others to do that, what I'm saying. But if I don't know, I'll do what I have to do. They're desperate to be different for the person they know themselves to be. I would change that from the person they think themselves to be, because I don't think they know who they are. And that's part of what this whole thing's about, to help them. They did not like where they were in life, what they were doing in life, and felt trapped. And that's that victim piece again. And so you can really see the family connection to a lot of his definition. Codependency is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation resulting in a lifestyle characterized by self-sabotage, over-attachment, and external focus of identity, which results in needs deprivation, the loss of my true self, and an above-average risk for chronic disease and premature death. The codependent family have the same risk for disease and death as the addict or the alcoholic because of the stress and not taking care of themselves. And here again, I think it's more than an external locus of control. I think it's an external locus of identity. Since I don't know who I am, I get my identity from out here, from what everybody else thinks about me. And that can put me in a bind, because that gives up a lot of power. And the loss of true self involves involves some grieving. I want to get back to the self-sabotage. Okay, yeah. Let's look at self-sabotage and how that plays into addiction. Got to put some hair up here, you know. Give him an arm, or her. Now, most addicts have a very negative sense of self. And if we believe, and I do, that in order for things to function, they have to be in balance. And it doesn't mean whether it's a positive or a negative balance. It can go either way. If this is the addict's inner self, out here, their world or their reality is going to have to look like this in order for them to feel balanced and reasonably safe and not to feel anxious all the time. Now, what happens when an addict out here starts getting better is it looks like that's a good thing. But for the addict, it doesn't match. There's a lot of stress, and he has a hard time trusting out here being okay, as long as in here is negative. Now, if he could change this in here to this, then it would match up, and that's what recovery looks like. I feel good in here, and my life looks good out here. And most addicts don't know how to change a negative inner self to a positive inner self. So when the anxiety builds up high enough, and they're kind of waiting for the shoe to drop, and they don't trust out here, instead of changing in here, they sabotage this to negative, so it matches their inner self. And here again, the way I deal with that is, when I see that, I'll say, hey, why can't you care about yourself better than that? Here again, that question. Where'd you learn to hate yourself so much? Because who do you hurt when you do that? And they'll almost always say me. And I'll say, well, maybe I'll look at what's wrong that you have to hurt yourself that way. And they won't know. Because they've been externalized from day one pretty much. And plus, looking in here is a lot scarier. Especially when it looks really bad and negative, you know. And so I stay focused out here. And as long as it's negative, it validates and it makes sense to me. If it starts to get better, I don't know what to do with that. We're going to have to mess that up. You see what I'm saying? Can't have that. So yeah, okay, that's good. Thank you. And detachment, like I say, I'm going to spend a whole class on that, means I need to unhook emotionally from the relationship and not just cut off physically. Because that's, cutting off physically doesn't fix the issues that it goes with me. If I smash my toe with a brick and throw the brick away, the brick's gone, but the effects are still there. And so the emotional aspect of it is what I need to understand and deal with. And we'll get to that. Okay. Then there's significant grief and loss work. Grief is a basic reaction to addiction. And most families suffer chronic, complicated grief on an ongoing basis. It just comes with the deal. Because there's a loss. Then self-reconciliation and redefinition, making me okay with me, and redefining myself around who I am instead of what's happened to me and how other people have treated me. And that sounds easier than it is too. Then the over-attachment piece complicates the detachment and enmeshment. See, the more I'm hooked into that relationship, the harder it's going to be for me to get out of it. And that will trigger withdrawal and all kinds of things, because a lot of my identity is built in that relationship. Inability to make and maintain meaningful relationships. You see, if if I confuse intimacy and intensity, I'm not going to know what to do, how to deal with a meaningful relationship. I'm not going to be capable of that. I happen to believe that addicts are incapable of meaningful relationship. So let's look at what that looks like. Here's some components necessary for a meaningful relationship. I think the most important ingredient in a healthy relationship is trust. Because can you have a healthy relationship with somebody you don't trust? Can you do business with a company or a store you don't trust? I don't think so. And what's the most important ingredient in trust? That should come up next, is honesty. So honesty is, I need to be honest with you about what's going on with me before you can trust me. And one of the problems with addiction is I don't know who I am, so I can't be honest. So part of that is learning that. But having some help with that, finding safe people and places where you can start to do that. Plus, that's how you find out whether a person's safe or not. Because it's kind of the bridge analogy. Have you ever seen that? That vulnerability is the bridge that connects us to each other. And I want you to come here, Perry, and we'll work with this one on you here. And if I walk around with my bridge like this all the time, what's going to happen? I'm never going to connect. And a lot of us learn more early that's how we survive. Mm-hmm. So in order for me to connect, I need to put my bridge out to you. Mm-hmm. And what has to happen in order for it to work? You've got to do the same thing. Mm-hmm. Now, what if you push your bridge out to me and I go, how are you going to feel?
Not so good.
like you got betrayed and hurt.
You rejected.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So, but let me take a look at that. Put your bridge out to me. Now, what needs to happen in order for it to work? And when I slap your hand away, who do you blame?
Me.
See, and that's what makes it hard. Now I don't feel betrayed and abandoned by you. I abandon myself by blaming myself. Now put your hand out again. Now what needs to happen for it to work? I need to put mine out. And if I do that, who blew it?
I see.
And maybe it's okay to let that be about me and say, you know, too bad you blew it, but I'm okay. I did what I need to do. So I don't have to be afraid to take that risk. And besides, that's how I find out who the safe people are. The people that slap it away, I just ruled you out, screened you out as a resource, you see. And it's risky, but once I learn I don't have to blame myself and shame myself for doing that, that makes it easier to do. Then I can let that be your problem. And then that's more of an external locus instead of letting what you do define whether I'm okay or not. And so that's one of the things in relationship. It starts with me being willing to trust that I'm okay for who I am. And if I do my part, then I'm off the hook. And then if I share my vulnerability and you take advantage of it, then you're not somebody I want to be around. And if you reciprocate it, then that's intimacy, and that's what healthy relationships are about. And so that's how I develop trust. And the honesty is putting my bridge out. You see what I'm saying? Reciprocity is a big part of a relationship. Reciprocity means that I give and I get something back. There's some give and take. Codependent relationships is usually I do all the giving and I don't get anything back. And what I would say is if you're in a relationship where you do all the giving and don't get anything back, that's not a relationship, that's a ripoff. You're not going to be able to trust that person, and that's not be conducive to intimacy or meaningful relationship. Okay, negotiation. Healthy relationships are based on negotiation and not manipulation. Now, addicts are really good at manipulating, but you know, a healthy relationship is we can both negotiate and work things out. And everybody gives a little bit and takes some, that kind of stuff. Respect is really important. And I define respect. I remember years ago when I was in graduate school, I was reading an article on core conditions for counseling. Things like empathy, unconditional positive regard, genuineness, all those kind of things. And one of them's respect. And I remember the definition. I always liked it. The definition was, I respect you by refusing to accept you at less than you can be. And that to me is where enabling comes in. It's very disrespectful. And I respect myself the same way. I'm not going to blame or do a number on myself when I don't do everything perfect, but I'm going to challenge myself to be the best that I can be with what I have to work with. And I'm going to do the same thing with you. So that to me is really important in meaningful relationships. Communication, obviously, and honest communication, and it goes both ways. I not only talk, but I hear. That's important. Separateness, that's important. Now, I call it separate togetherness. Now, in a healthy relationship, we have our own identities. We're our own people, but we also have a kind of a we identity, you know. We have there's a we, but there's also my own separate part of that. And I have my own separate stuff, and you have yours, and I respect that. But then we come together to work together on our we issue. So I think that separate togetherness is really important. And it's also respectful, and it's a condition of meaningful relationship. It means remaining detached emotionally, which is unhooked emotionally from the addictive relationship. It means developing a long-term recovery support system. People that can help me. They can be 12-step groups. It can be sponsors. Sponsors is just another word for friend or mentor. Safe friends, mentors, counseling or support groups. The ability to make and maintain meaningful relationships is a long-term recovery goal. And churches. I think churches ought to have a role in that. They don't always do, which frustrates me sometimes, but they ought to be one of those safe places as part of that support structure. And for a lot of people they are, but not for a lot of people. So this is the criteria for once I get there, I got to do something to maintain it. Because anything you don't maintain, you lose. And so it's important. You know, it's not, you know, you hear people say, well, I did that, or I've worked through that. I don't do that. I don't think there's any such thing. I think it's always a doing and working through it. And there's an old saying, the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. And when you first start, what you see is the tip of the iceberg. And the more you learn, the more you realize, holy mackerel. Can't believe that. But that also can be a way to incriminate yourself, or it can be a way to challenge yourself to keep growing and validate yourself. I think using it to help you grow makes a lot more sense. But it's a process. And I've been at it a long time. I figure it's about a 60-year job on a good day.